I'm Andrew Buss, and I'm Research Director at IDC here in Europe, covering our enterprise infrastructure research across both the core data center environments, through the cloud to the edge. And today I'd like to take you through what IDC sees as the future of digital infrastructure. For a long time, the IT that we've been building has very much been a reactive approach, often disconnected, and we've often built individual silos for applications that, while individually optimized, have not really worked as well together as we may have liked. And the pandemic that we've seen in 2020, together with a shift over the last decade towards a lot more digital applications, means that the infrastructure we've currently built is making it harder for us to reach the goals that we need to as a business in terms of growth, profitability, and the ability to respond to competitive changes in the market. On the next slide, I would like to just highlight to you that most businesses these days depend heavily on their digital infrastructure to not only deliver back office efficiencies, but to actually reach and engage with customers, as well as being able to source goods and materials for supply chains. So more and more over the last decade, we've built apps and services that we've often deployed in a haphazard manner. We haven't really had a strategy that's allowed us to build this, manage it, and optimize it efficiently over time. And really, we have to try and change how we do this. And this is really the challenge that we face as an industry going forward, is how do we get our IT humming on all the cylinders, really being optimized and delivering what we need. If we move to the next slide, what we have found through a survey that we ran in May 2020 here in Europe is that the digital platform is still a dream for most organizations. We looked across 10 different elements of advanced IT that really define a digital organization. Everything from trust, automation, DevOps, new types of applications, AI, machine learning, etc. And what we found was some companies have really gone into this wholeheartedly, but many have a long way to go to reach digital excellence. And what it means is, how do we get there? How are we actually going to achieve this in what looks like almost an extreme approach to running IT? But I think one of the lessons we can take from this is the hyperscale cloud providers have shown this is very much possible, but a growing proportion of enterprises are realizing that this is necessary and are looking to take best practice from those who've managed to implement it to accelerate their transformation from essentially an efficient digital organization to one that actually drives new revenue through their digital infrastructure. And if we can move to the next slide, please. What we did when we looked at the respondents to this survey was we scored them for how much of each digital platform element they had adopted. And we could separate the respondents into really three camps. So about a third of the market is what we'd call a digital follower. So a company that's really trying to cut costs out of IT and not investing for the future. About half were digital mainstream, which is running IT pretty efficiently, but not really cutting edge. And about a quarter were what we'd call the digital leaders. So these are the companies that see IT as a competitive advantage, and they're actively investing in the capabilities to really drive their digital capabilities and platforms forward. And if we look to the right of this slide, we can actually see the differentiation between them. So the green is the digital leaders, of course, the orange, the mainstream, and the red is the digital followers. And we can see that the digital leaders invest heavily and use extensively pretty much all of the elements of the digital platform. About the most lagging one at the moment is AI in a formal business use case. And really that's because AI is fairly late and immature and is really just becoming established. But overall, these digital leaders make full use of the digital platform and they use it to drive enhanced growth. What we saw in the survey is the digital leaders often saw 2 to 3 times the rate of growth as the digital mainstream and particularly also the digital followers. So it's translating really directly into revenue and profitability for the companies, but also it's proving that they are more agile. They're able to capture more wallet within existing markets, plus also transition to new markets and capture them with innovation and new revenue streams. So it's vitally important for companies long-term to really have a healthy digital platform. If we move to the next slide, please. So what are they doing differently in many cases? Well, what we also found was that despite the pandemic, the digital leaders are investing heavily in their IT infrastructure. So they've already got world-class adoption of the 10 elements of the digital platform, but they're continuing to invest. And one of the ways that they're doing this is shifting away from an annual-based approach in terms of CapEx and annual IT budgets for specific projects, and very much moving towards a leasing model or increasingly a consumption-based approach where you're paying monthly or annually for the services and applications that you actually use. So more and more those digital leaders are relying on a new way to actually purchase and fund their IT. And we see this as one of the absolutely critical elements for the success of the future of digital infrastructures, moving away from large-scale upfront investments to ones that are more targeted on a consumption-based approach over time and paying for what you use, allowing IT to be a lot more agile and flexible in how it approaches new and emerging problems. Because to be honest, if we bought IT infrastructure 2 or 3 years ago, planning for a future, who would have foreseen 2020 and the effect that's had? But being able to use a consumption approach to change the apps, the infrastructure, and the mix that you have is vitally important. We move to the next slide, please. And what we can see is that this is changing what we want out of our technology platforms. So we're heading towards a market where we are innovating a lot more. We expect IT to help us innovate. And really what this means is we need to take the routine cost out of IT. And too often we've built our IT in a way that consumes a lot of our IT budget just to keep the lights on. And in many of the surveys we do, this is anywhere from between 60 to 75% of the entire IT budget. That doesn't allow a lot to reinvest in innovation once we think about renewals and refreshes and things like that. So one of the keys is to use a digital platform to have very efficient IT back office capabilities. The user expectations are going up, and all of us pretty much now have smartphones and are expecting to be online with access to applications and information 24/7. And even slight outages can cause us really to think about, or do we go to a competitor? So being able to have new and better apps and have that data available 24/7 is absolutely key. But we also have to think about how we build and operate these. Can you just build out one more, please? And that is to think about who helps us build this infrastructure. For a long time, most companies have thought their requirements are unique and have often built bespoke architectures and infrastructure to run their applications. But going forwards, we need to actually have an adaptable, scalable, but standardized infrastructure. And we need to turn to service providers and others who can build infrastructure to the scale needed and with the world-class integration that's needed to really have an effective digital foundation. So turning more and more to cloud providers and service providers and integrators to really help us build that type of digital platform. We move to the next slide, please. But it's also about collaborating internally. So while we can build a technological base that is best on planet, unless we take the rest of an organization with us and work in lockstep, it's often not used to its fullest extent or even rejected by the users who you've spent all this time and effort building your foundations for. So a successful digital foundation and the future of digital infrastructure really depends on bringing together the lines of business, who ultimately are the ones who bring in the money for the company and that fund the role of IT. It's about the new digital developers, the people who are building the building blocks of the future of the business, to engage with supply chains, provide for the internal processes and functions and research and development that's needed, but also bringing together IT ops. And one of the things we see at the moment is that IT is effectively 3 to 4 years behind where DevOps is at this moment. So the developers are really pushing the limits in terms of what's achievable. They're often pushing the boundaries of security and manageability. And we're looking for next generation IT that is adaptable and manageable and highly orchestrated to keep up with DevOps, and moving towards cloud native platforms built on containers and Kubernetes and next generation of development principles. And one of the things we must not forget is we've still got a huge amount of our existing IT that's delivering value. And all of that needs to also be supported in our next generation digital platforms. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So this means we're having a shifting application portfolio. Digital businesses are going to have new applications across many different areas of IT and of the business that have never really been serviced before. So we're going to have new workloads emerging in the edge. We're going to have these really spread out across an organization that require you to think about how do you deploy the hardware? How do you deploy and service the apps that run on them? And how do you actually service the kit that's deployed maybe to hundreds or thousands of locations? We're going to have applications that run cloud natively that we don't have to think about because we're buying them fully as a service, for example. And most of the new applications that are being developed on cloud native principles, very different from what we've had in the past. So moving away from traditional client server, big monolithic applications to applications that are really tiny, that deploy on microservice meshes, for example, but when you aggregate them together, deliver massive value to a company. So all in all, a huge change in how we build apps, and we expect each app to really connect to or be dependent on 2, 3, 4 other applications to actually deliver the value to the business. So going forwards, we can expect our applications to move really out of core controlled data centers into the cloud, into the edge, and also into hosted environments. If we can move to the next slide, please. So one of the ways to think about this is our ideal state for IT is not to really think about how should we deploy this app today. It's about what does the business need and how do we go about solving that in the best way possible. So we shouldn't think in either an on-premises view or a cloud view first. We need to think about what we need to achieve and then think about the best way through that. Today, most companies are embracing cloud, but it's still a minor portion of IT spend. But over time, it's becoming more accepted, and we see this growing. But we also see the on-premises infrastructure almost fighting back. So we've seen a rapid shift from traditional IT to on-premises private clouds that are very effective and increasingly are hybridizing so that you can run part of your workloads on-premises and part of your workloads in the public cloud. And on top of that, we're seeing major horizontal apps being deployed purely through SaaS, so requiring absolutely no software or infrastructure to be deployed either in the public cloud or on-premise, just bought as a service. We also need to think about the criticality of the applications and how it factors into both our supply chains, our operations, but also the user experience going forward. We see a number of applications are mission critical, where minutes of downtime can be millions of dollars worth of lost revenue, for example. Many companies have been reluctant to move these into the cloud, but in 2020, we've actually seen an acceptance that public cloud can actually deliver for some of the most demanding applications. SAP HANA, for example, is now available on AWS, Azure, and Google, and companies are actually quite willing to move to their most critical applications to these providers, for example. But on the whole, what we found is a migration strategy. Many companies will move their second and third tier applications that are not nearly so reliability or performance critical into the cloud, experiment over time, and then once you have a good feeling for it, you can move more of the application estate. But the general feedback we get from the surveys that we've run is most companies actually prefer a balance, being able to run either in the cloud or on premises and not be tied to one or the other. In fact, we still see a bit of a preference to running workloads in the on-premises environment where possible over running purely in the public cloud. And as we see as well, the new rise of apps and services mean applications are moving out of the core data center into secondary, but also increasingly much smaller locations at the edge where bespoke hardware and applications are being deployed and are posing brand new challenges for IT operations to get on top of. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of IT in the past has been very well thought out or optimized for a particular business. But going forwards, businesses are no longer quite as unique as they like to think they are. So part of your challenge is to move beyond the not invented here syndrome and to think about how to buy in world-class designs with world-class expertise and how to build and operate them, so that you can get your IT a head start on the competition. We're moving now towards integrated cloud stacks. So if we think about the main public clouds, you've got really AWS, you've got Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud Platform, IBM Cloud, and others. And what we're starting to see is those software stacks are actually migrating into the on-premises data center. So we're able to have fully functional cloud stacks being able to be deployed quickly and easily, and have applications that were written for the public cloud running internally on our private clouds. So part of the challenge is to think about moving beyond self-built, self-managed, customized environments to those that are very much designed to scale and to be automated, and to think of the automation as being built in. And it's a difficult challenge for us because, as we saw at the beginning of the presentation, automation orchestration is pretty much limited to the digital leaders, and that's probably about 20 to 25% of you. So think about how you can bring these advanced types of IT and digital platforms into your environment and make use of best practice that integrators and service providers can help you with. And building on the back of this, if we move to the next slide, please. One of the things that we saw in our survey in May of this year is that the digital leaders themselves actually think of new ways to actually build their entire IT environment, not just the infrastructure, but where you run it. And one of the questions we asked is, for example, use of co-location facilities. Now, a lot of you may not be that familiar with co-location, but it's essentially being able to use the facilities as a service. It's data center space with power space and cooling, together with things like internet connectivity, plus also co-location with cloud providers. So AWS, Azure, and Google often also co-locate in major co-location facilities. But one of the benefits this brings is best practice in data center design for the entire facility, for everything from the cooling through to the electrical supply, etc., as well as to the multi-service provider choice you get in terms of the data services you can make use of. A modern data center for an enterprise probably has a PUE between 2 and 2.5, according to our research. But for a major provider like a Equinix or a Rackspace or a Google, that's often between 1.05 to 1.15. So a huge increase in efficiency just from a sustainability and energy consumption point of view. So one of the things to think about is, if you're needing to bring your data center up to speed in terms of being capable for 24/7 operations in this new digital demanding environment, is to think of, again, using best practice that's out there. Why build it yourself when it's already available, and you can vastly improve the delivery of your IT services by thinking this way. We move to the next slide, please. So when we think about moving to cloud, we can really think about this as a journey that can be done in bite-sized chunks. It's to prioritize what needs to be done in the short, medium, and long term and make a plan for it. But think about how you fund it, and think about very much using the facilities from your vendors and from your service providers to really change your CapEx into OpEx to make this a lot more achievable. We think that funding IT in a new way is really the way to go about transforming IT and allowing a long-term strategic investment that pays back over many years, but having the benefits upfront within, say, the first 12 to 18 months, rather than doing it piecemeal and only achieving the benefits maybe 6-7 years down the line. So think about the financing alongside the transformation of your infrastructure. We move to the next slide, please. So going forwards, and if we can build out the slide, we need to think about the technology itself. So how can you get software-defined everything, and very much focus much more on new types of workloads and how you can use memory-based approaches to accelerating all of this. We can build out again, please. We need to think how we deploy, manage, and service this, and focus a lot more on being able to automate a lot of this and use key performance indicators to make sure we're on top of everything working properly. And if we build again, please. And we need to make sure that our operations can actually help us scale. So moving beyond human-based management, where humans have to make every decision in the loop, to one where deep learning and artificial intelligence, for example, can do a lot of the monitoring and bring to our attention when things are starting to look off nominal. So then really just having human or basically intelligence augmented decision making, where the human in the loop is taking the key decisions, not making every decision. And that really is where we're looking to go with the future of digital infrastructure that is scalable, performs highly, is really software defined, and it is hallmarked by automation. We move to the next slide, please. So just want to leave you with some predictions as to where we think infrastructure is going and what it's going to have to support. Increasingly, there's going to be interdependencies between apps and their new types of apps. So rather than the big monolithic apps of old, it's going to be swarms of new apps that really depend on communication. We're going to have hyper-customization, so smaller apps that are much more relevant to the particular business we're running. So no more huge suites where we use 20% of the functions of an app. It's going to be highly customized in terms of workloads on a largely generic infrastructure. We're going to move towards flexible consumption, so pay as you use on a consumption approach. And we're going to have essentially much more diverse range of workloads, each highly targeted to specific parts of the business. And those workloads are going to swarm out from our core data centers very much into hundreds or thousands of edge locations. That will mean a new way of thinking of how we need to deploy and manage workloads. And if we move on, please. So with that, I'd like to thank you and leave you just with those thoughts of the future of digital infrastructure. So again, I'm Andrew Buss, and please feel free to reach out and contact me with any questions.